Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and today we have our meta report video, the first meta report of this new format, the new metagame that came with Shining Revelry. I'm super excited. We have a lot to talk about. So I think this is going to be a big one, mainly because a lot of people are interested from a metagame perspective with all of these new cards that came out with Giratina with Red. Massive changes have happened, and of course rank battles came out. So before we really get into this video, I'm going to talk about one thing in particular, and that is the difference between like the ranked battles and the ranked mode in game in Pokemon Pocket and these online tournaments that we cover every week. So of course it's going to be a little bit different. Like the format is of course different in tournaments. However, I do think that all of the data that we talk about all of the time and the metagame analysis that we do here on the channel when we take a look at the online tournaments, we can directly translate that to ranked mode in figuring out, how the matchups work, what the best decks are to play, and what decks are kind of seeing the most play. So keep that in mind. I know a lot of people might be, thinking in their minds that ranked battles and tournaments are separate, and they are technically, but I think the data really does translate well between the two. So hopefully this video finds you well, and hopefully it's a useful video for you guys. But anyway, let's get right into it. And actually, we're going to be doing something a little bit different from like here on out in these meta report videos. I'm actually going to be going over this metagame tab and the metagame data before we go into the standings and the deck lists. That way we're able to get a lot more context when we, then see kind of, how all of these decks did in the, in the final bracket and things like that. So this is the metagame tab for the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly tournament this past weekend. Again, the first major tournament of this new format, and there was about 1,000 people competing. That is a little bit less than what we normally get here at the Ursa Days tournaments. I say we, but, them, meaning Ursa Day and her tournaments. But I think the main reason for that is because a lot of people were grinding the ranked ladder, so less people were competing in the tournament. But again, still a massive sample size, and we should be able to pull a lot of great data out of this. So this was the metagame tab, and as we see here, Giratina and Darkrai EX was the #1 most played deck at 18.5% meta share. I might have something to do with this. This was sort of the video that I initially made as my first, top strongest deck video, and a lot of people did watch that, so maybe I had something to do with it, maybe not. I'm not, I'm gonna toot my own horn, but I'm just saying, I did call this the strongest deck day one. So, and I do think it is honestly one of the strongest decks. Now, what we see here is about a 50% win rate. I'm not actually too surprised about that. I think that most of the decks here in the early meta are going to fall around 50% because things are very, very spread out. So there's less counterplay, and I think most decks realistically, especially in a tournament setting where you as you win games, you're playing against other people of either the same decks or top decks that also, have been winning games. So a lot of the top decks typically do fall around 50%, and we see that with Giratina and Darkrai EX. The other thing to keep in mind is that this particular archetype, players playing this deck ended up playing other people playing the same deck more often, right? Because it was the most played deck. So about a 50% win rate there, 469 to 460. And as we see here, Gallade EX and Hitmonlee was the second most played deck. And Hitmonlee, I think, is very well positioned in the format. I've said this a number of different times. Going down to about 12% meta share, still very significant, 117 people. And yet again, about a 50% win rate here. Again, no super big surprise. Don't really read into the win rates here. I do think that both of these decks are really, really high up on the ladder. And then at the third most played deck was Gyarados with about 10% meta share. And this had about a 51.5% meta share, or win rate rather, which is really interesting. And I'll tell you why. Is because Gyarados and Manaphy kind of has an auto-lose matchup to Gallade and Hitmonlee, particularly Hitmonlee. So the fact that 100 Gyarados players had a higher win rate than 117 Gallade players in this tournament basically tells me that Gyarados actually, is an extremely strong deck. Even though there were so many Hitmonlee and Gallade decks in this tournament, it still managed to have almost a 52% win rate, which is really, really phenomenal. And then at the fourth place, we have Dialga and Arceus. I think this makes sense. It was the top deck of last format. A lot of people don't necessarily have all of the new cards yet, at least at the time of this tournament, which, kind of makes sense, right? The fourth most played deck here, 7.5% meta share. However, we see a 41 or 40% win rate here, and this is definitely a little bit lower than what we would want. Dialga and Arceus, I do think, is much less well positioned in the format right now. I think that you can pair it with Giratina, and that does make things a little bit better for you. But for the most part, I think that Red and Mewtwo kind of rising back up in the format, things like Giratina being able to hit for 150 with Red, there's just a big difference, I think, in basically all of the breakpoints that we're seeing in the format right now. Things like Dialga and Arceus are just a little bit more underwhelming. Excuse me. Then a lot of the new, or not the new cards, but a lot of cards able to do extra damage with red now. Arceus kind of falls under those breakpoints, both in its damage output and its amount of HP that it has, even with Giant Cape. So keep that in mind. 40% is not great. Not a great outing for Dialga and Arceus. I do expect this deck to see less play as time goes on. I just don't think it's as well positioned now in the metagame, with red seeing so much play in basically every deck. And here we see Rampardos and Lucario. Now, not to be confused with, if you scroll down here, Rampardos and Hitmonlee, these sample sizes are going to get a little bit smaller, so keep in mind the data isn't as bulletproof, but Rampardos and Lucario, meaning without Hitmonlee, had about a 48% win rate, so again, pretty close to 50%, nothing too substantial there. And then Weavile and Darkrai EX actually had a 52% win rate. So realistically, I do think that Dark decks are pretty well positioned, I think because there's so much Giratina in the format, but also, the Darkrai extra damage from its ability, the Nightmare Aura ability, plus the damage from red is enough to take a lot of KOs, so I do think Darkrai much better in the format right now. Weavile and Darkrai is probably the #1 aggro deck in the format, so I really do like this deck and how it's positioned here, 52% win rate. Articuno EX did struggle here at 46%. Now, I actually had Articuno EX a little bit higher. I thought that the new inclusions of, Team Rocket Grunt and Red would make Articuno a little bit better, but it's actually having almost the inverse effect. So Articuno, again, with Giant Cape is 160. A lot of Pokemon are able to one-hit KO Articuno now because of Red. So I don't think Articuno is nearly as well positioned as I thought it might be. I do still think it's probably a top 5, top 6, top 7 deck in the format, especially in the ranked ladder, because, you can kind of win and lose games so quickly with Articuno. Again, some people are going to ask me, why are we playing 2 copies of Pokeball and Articuno? I get that comment every week. We need that second Articuno. It's basically the only way we're not going to lose matches. So 2 Pokeballs further increases the odds that we get that Articuno EX, the second one that is. Okay, so now if we go down, this is going to be by far the most, I think, interesting statistic here. And this is Giratina EX with Mewtwo EX. This is a deck that I have been talking about a lot. I played a bunch of games in my recent live stream on the ranked ladder in Ultra Ball ranked with this deck, and it performed extremely well. I'm about 72% win rate in ranked mode with this list. That includes all of the, the matches from the lower ranks as well, which of course are easier to win. And only 25 people playing this deck in the tournament, so not a massive sample size here, but 106 wins and only 60 losses. That is a 62, almost a 63% win rate. So again, smaller sample size, but a very, very good showing for Mewtwo. Mewtwo is back. I've been saying this. I included it sort of as the final deck that I talked about in yesterday's video. We're going to be talking about Mewtwo a lot. I think also Mewtwo has a pretty good matchup against Giratina and Darkrai EX. I'm not going to go into all of the matchup data right now. I think maybe next week when we get a larger total sample size, we'll go in and we'll kind of analyze some of the matchups and we'll understand that in more detail. But yeah, this tournament here, Giratina and Mewtwo did extremely well. And as you'll see when we look at the standings, just a very, very good showing for mainly all Mewtwo decks. I think Mewtwo is very well positioned. This list here is a little bit different. Mewtwo EX and Giratina, I'm not sure exactly what the difference is here, but this only had a 43% win rate. So again, I don't know. It's only 19 and 25. So again, very small sample sizes, but Charizard here was still seeing a little bit of play. 23 people played Charizard. It went 48 and 63, 43% win rate. Again, nothing too phenomenal. And then Executor in Meowscarada here, 26 and 35. Again, don't spend too much time taking a look at these win rates, and we won't either in this video because the sample sizes are just a little bit smaller. So as the weeks go on, we'll get a larger sample size about some of these maybe lesser played decks, and we'll kind of get a better understanding of how good they actually are performing in the metagame. However, Rampardos with Hitmonlee, not to be confused without Hitmonlee as we saw up here, did actually do pretty well. Only 11 players, but 37 and 24. That's a 60% win rate, pretty substantial as well. And if we go down here, we see a couple other, Giratina, based decks here. Darkrai and Greninja also, I think, pretty well positioned in the format right now. A couple other grass type decks, Executor and Celebi, 23 and 20. So again, small sample sizes as we go down, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about them because I don't think that the data, has enough substantiality to it. Is that a word? So we're not going to spend too much time taking a look at that. But yeah, anyway, that is the metagame tab. So keep all of this in mind as we now go into the standings, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at the deck lists. And these are the final results from this 1,000 player Ursa Days tournament, guys. Are you ready? Let's get right into it. Let's take a look at the standings, and here they are. So these were the decks that, I guess at the end of the tournament, at the end of Top Cut, which I believe was Top 32 Cut, ended up, placing here in the tournament. As we see, Giratina and Mewtwo did take first place at this week's tournament. Let's go ahead and take a look at the deck list here because I do think it's somewhat interesting. I'm really high on this deck. I've talked about it a number of different times, but we'll go in some more detail here. 2 Giratina and 1 Mewtwo. I know some people are asking, should we play a second Mewtwo? Do we need 2 Giratina? I do. I think that having Giratina out as early as possible is what's most important for this deck so that we can use that Broken Space Bellow on our first turn and go, especially if we're going first, so we can go +1 on energy. So I think 2 Giratina, definitely correct. It's a Pokemon that we definitely want at least on our board as early as possible. If we start with it, that's totally fine. And then 1 copy of Mewtwo. And again, we don't need 2 copies of Mewtwo, right? Some matchups, if we don't get Mewtwo, then it can be really rough. And in fact, we probably will lose. But again, 2 copies of Giratina means that if we do start with Giratina, we have a 50-50 chance of pulling either the second Giratina or Mewtwo out from Pokeball. So again, I don't think Mewtwo is a Pokemon that we necessarily need in the early game. We would rather have Giratina as a starting Pokemon. So I do think 2 Giratina, 1 Mewtwo is correct. I will say that the one downside to this deck is that sometimes you just don't draw any of your Pokeballs or any of your other Pokemon or your research, right? I mean, realistically, we can't do anything more to guarantee us having Giratina out because we're running 2 Giratina, 2 Professor's Research, 2 Pokeballs. So it's about as consistent as possible as we, can possibly be making this deck to have Giratina in the early game. But that 1 copy of Mewtwo does mean that sometimes we don't get that Mewtwo out early enough, and that can be the difference in some matchups in terms of winning or losing. But overall, I think that 2 Giratina, 1 Mewtwo is correct. And the other great thing about this deck is that we're playing only 3 Pokemon, so we have 17 slots in our deck to play trainer cards, and there's a lot of good trainer cards in the format right now. Now, 2 copies of Professor's Research, I think that's kind of needed in the format, and then 2 copies of Red, and I do think 2 copies of Red is also needed. It's our main win condition to do that extra 20 damage, to take KOs on basically everything in the format, especially with Mewtwo. We also have 1 Rocky Helmet as some additional damage modifiers to, again, also fix the math against maybe some higher HP Pokemon, things like Gallade, maybe things like Meowscarada, which we can't, do more damage to with Red. Or, of course, things like Gyarados, right, which, of course, also have a lot of HP. So Rocky Helmet, also really important in the matchup. 1 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus. I think that's pretty standard, again, for most decks, and I think that's probably correct in this list. And what we see here, and I'm going to spend some time talking about this as well, is 1 Pokemon Center Lady and 2 Potions. Now, I'm not a big believer in Potion as a card. I don't think that it's necessarily, like, the best card we could play in this deck, but the thing is, and we saw it there in the metagame tab, that so many people were playing Darkrai decks, and those potions are really being played in this deck to help counteract that additional chip damage that our active Pokemon is taking from the Giratina's ability. So 1 Pokemon Center Lady, 2 Potions, extra healing played in this list to, again, further increase our healing to then counteract that additional damage that Darkrai really relies on to be able to KO us. 2 Giant Cape, again, also extending our HP, very important. And as we see here, 1 Mars, 1 Dawn, and 1 Leaf. So I think Leaf, at least 1 copy of Leaf is good in the deck. In my playtesting, I've actually wanted sometimes to have 2 copies of Leaf in the deck. I was playing 2 copies of Dawn for a while because it's also a really important win condition. But I think for the most part, in the current metagame with how many people are playing Darkrai and Giratina, I don't think that we really need 2 copies of Dawn as much as we'd probably do the potion. So I think that kind of makes sense. Mars, again, is super clutch. I actually have been swapping out Mars for Giovanni on the ranked ladder because this is a deck that can actually struggle against Meowscarada, particularly Meowscaradas with Giant Cape. They have 160 HP, and without Giovanni, we don't really have a way, other than Rocky Helmet, I guess, of doing that 160 damage to Meowscarada. So I've been cutting the Mars for 1 copy of Giovanni, but again, it really depends on, what other decks in the format are seeing play. On the ranked ladder, I've been seeing a lot of grass decks with Meowscarada, so that's why I swapped that out for a Giovanni. But yeah, this deck really has it all. I know some people were confused, like, how come Mewtwo in Giratina is doing well when there's so much Darkrai, right? Aren't these psychic Pokemon weak to Dark? They are, but that really doesn't matter that much because Mewtwo EX with Giant Cape has 170 HP. With Potion, with Pokemon Center Lady, we're able to keep our Pokemon at pretty high HP counts, which means that Darkrai or Giratina actually don't do enough damage to one-hit KO our Mewtwo and our Giratina, whereas Mewtwo can one-hit KO them, especially with Red, right? So I think that's the main upside to this particular matchup, and I do think that Mewtwo actually has a favorable matchup against Giratina and Darkrai. However, I do think we still struggle a lot against Weavile and Darkrai, which is, again, entirely Dark type and a bit more fast-paced, but that's sort of beside the point. But yeah, Mewtwo getting first place this week, I'm actually not too surprised by it. I'm actually more surprised at the decks that got second place and third place, and that is actually Dialga and Arceus. So again, the 4th most played deck of this tournament, and had a pretty bad win rate overall. Can we, is this gonna work? Let me, I guess, reload the page here. Sometimes it doesn't work. Hold on. Is my internet broken? What's going on here? Did the web page break? Let's reload. Is it working now? No? Is Limitless not working? I might have to edit. Oh, there it goes. Okay. All right. I got afraid there. I'd have to do some editing in this video. I don't typically like to edit my videos. Okay. Anyway, Arceus Dialga, it's still a deck. And again, with Mew EX, with Shaman, this is all of the same stuff that we've been playing. Now we have one copy of Red in the deck. You know, it's not a terrible list. It really isn't. Again, I think it's not as well positioned in the format now as it was, but, you know, enough people were playing it. It's enough of a good deck that, you know what, it didn't end up getting second place. I think it lost to Mewtwo in the finals, of course, but still a quality deck list. And I do think that it does belong sort of in that, you know, probably a high B tier, low A tier range. We'll see tomorrow in the tier list, but still a significant player in the format. We'll see how many people continue to play Arceus and Dialga. Have been favoring sort of against it, but, you know, some people still like this list. And again, if you don't have all of the new cards, it's probably still a pretty decent choice. Again, we can just slap one Pokemon Center Lady, one red in the deck, a couple of potions. Again, stuff to counteract all of those Darkrai decks, and it's still a significant player in the format. We'll have to see how it does next week. But anyway, second place for Dialga and Arceus. That did surprise me, but also Charizard here up in third place here. And Charizard is an interesting one. So this list is actually kind of strange to me. We're playing 2 Charmander, 2 Charmeleon, 2 Charizard, 2 Moltres, and then 1 of the Sky Support Shaman. So we're not playing Leaf in the deck. We're actually just relying on Sky Support Shaman and 1 copy of X-Speed to help get that Moltres out of the active spot. I actually don't mind this particularly because, you know, Sky Support Shaman is a card that we can draw into a little bit more consistently with Pokeball, with Pokemon Communications, with Professor's Research, and again, that gives this Charmander here free retreat in the early game to then go into Moltres. But yeah, I mean, Charizard is Charizard. I've seen a lot of people playing Iono in their list to give their deck a little bit more consistency, and I do think Iono is probably correct in Charizard, even though this list wasn't playing Iono. Charizard is still Charizard. So yes, I was surprised to see it get third place in this tournament, especially with only, you know, a 43% win rate overall in this tournament. But here's the thing with Charizard is that sometimes it just does what it does. There's not much you can do with Charizard once it gets like fully set up on turn 3. You're probably gonna lose. It's not super consistent, but you know what? Sometimes people get lucky playing Charizard and they just sort of get it set up very consistently over and over again. I don't know if I would really recommend Charizard as sort of a, you know, a ranked battles deck or a deck that consistently can win, but here's the thing with Charizard is that if you get lucky and you're going to win the match. So Charizard doing Charizard things, getting third place early on in a format, not really surprised by that. And then here's Sneak here from Venezuela, 4th place, and this is going to be Darkrai and Giratina. So again, the most played deck of this tournament. We do see 1 Flagrant Flower Garden Shaman. I do think this is probably to counteract the mirror match, and then again, we're running the Druddigon Darkrai Giratina combination. So I do like this list. Again, I do think it's probably one of the top decks in the format, but I think a lot of people are building their decks sort of around this matchup, again, with potions with Pokemon Center Lady or Flagrant Flower Garden Shaman. All of these different healing cards to help counteract that Nightmare Aura damage from Darkrai. So we do have counterplay to Darkrai, but realistically, I think because so many people were counterplaying this deck, it really goes to show how strong this deck really is. Again, I did make a video on this deck day 1. I thought it was incredible. It's actually what I used for the first day of ranked gameplay until I swapped over to Mewtwo. I do think this deck is still really, really good. 2 Professor's Research, 2 Red, 1 Leaf, 1 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus, and 1 Mars. So we're not playing any healing ourselves in this deck. We're going all in on the typical strategy here. Again, I think the one counterplay inclusion to this deck is the Flagrant Flower Garden Shaman, and I think it does work out, right? I mean, I think realistically, we don't need, like a second Darkrai or a second Giratina on our bench. So once Druddigon does go down, we have room to kind of throw down Shaman and, you know, put it on our bench, and it's going to heal and provide value for sure. So I like this list, and you know what? I don't really have too much else to say about it. We've talked about it a lot as time goes on. I think 1 copy of Mars is fairly correct, and 1 Rocky Helmet, 2 Giant Cape seems to be the consensus for all of these Giratina decks. So yeah, I think it's a really, really good deck. I don't think that it's going to be as dominant in this format as, you know, maybe some other decks were in early formats, because I think there's other really strong players here. Again, we have Mewtwo, we have Weavile Darkrai, we have Gallade, we have Gyarados, right? So there's a lot of other really strong decks in the format. And again, there is, of course, counterplay with potions and stuff to counteract Darkrai. At 5th place, there's another Giratina and Mewtwo deck here. Let's take a look at this one to see if there's any difference here, and there is, yeah. So again, I actually really like this list as well. So still 2 Giratina and 1 Mewtwo. Now we're playing a little bit more of a consistency deck in terms of the mirror match, but also like playing to our outs, right? So we have 2 Professor's Research, 2 Leaf, 2 Dawn, 2 Sabrina, 2 Red, and then 1 Cyrus and 1 Blue. So Blue is actually a really interesting card. I think that if more people end up playing Mewtwo and you end up playing this mirror match all of the time, I think that Blue is extremely useful. This is kind of a throwback to, I think, Mythical Island when Mewtwo EX was really kind of the top deck of the format. Blue was really the one card that really helped you in the mirror match, especially with Red now, 170 HP on Mewtwo. With Giant Cape, you're not safe because Mewtwo can just hit you for 170. So Blue really is that card to allow you to live an attack from Mewtwo, opposing Mewtwo's, but also things like Palkia. So Blue is a very relevant card, I think, especially if more people end up playing Mewtwo EX. We'll have to see exactly what happens in the next upcoming weeks, but I do expect Mewtwo to probably end up being the #1 most played deck, at least at some point. And then again, Dawn is really good. It is sort of also like a win condition card, the same as Red. Red is going to allow you to do, 20 extra damage, but Dawn is going to allow you to attack maybe a turn earlier, or, like I was saying earlier in my previous video about this deck, is that Mewtwo can attack once with Red, but we're discarding 2 energy, so the only way we can attack back-to-back is with Dawn, and we can't play Dawn in Red in the same turn. So Dawn is nice because, again, it allows us to attack maybe a turn earlier with Mewtwo, or attack back-to-back with Mewtwo, a very important win condition card. So I like 2 Dawn in the deck, and I like 2 Red, and I actually like 2 Leaf as well. Again, a very good consistency card. Sometimes Mewtwo's in the active spot, and when we're going up against Darkrai, we don't want it in the active. We don't want to take all of that extra damage, so Leaf allows us to maybe retreat out for free, go into our Giratina, which can soak up that damage, and then we can keep Mewtwo up at 170 HP to then take the KO, live an attack, take another KO, and that's the game, right? So I like 2 copies of Leaf in the deck for sure, and then 2 Sabrina, and I think that in a format right now with tons of Druddigon and a lot of, active Pokemon that we don't necessarily want to focus on, things like Hitmonlee, maybe things like Manaphy, we would rather play an early Sabrina and maybe just go ahead and take a KO on a Gyarados on the bench, or like a Kirlia that hasn't evolved yet, things like that. So I like 2 Sabrina as well. This is a much more sort of consistency build. We're not teching in a lot of cards for particular matchups. We're really just playing a bunch of cards that I think are best for what this deck is trying to do, and I really, really like this version of the list as well. And again, there's a lot of flexibility in these Mewtwo decks because we have so much room for trainer cards. Realistically, whatever I think the metagame calls for at any given time, you can adjust some of those ancillary, trainer cards that are in the deck. So yeah, Mewtwo extremely good. Again, 5th place and 1st place of this tournament, very high win rate, especially for how many people were playing this deck. It really wasn't the most popular deck at all. And here we have Weavile and Darkrai, another top player I think in the format right now. Just aggro Dark is really good with all of the Psychic type cards seeing play. Fast pace, aggressive. Again, we have Red. We have some potions and Giant Capes probably for the mirror match. We have Dawn as well to do some early Dawn combo shenanigans. I like the list. I do. I think that Weavile Darkrai is very well positioned. I think that being Dark type is really good right now. Weavile being able to attack on turn 2, just really, really strong. Yeah, I like this deck. I think it's as consistent as really any deck is in the format right now, and I think it has a very good matchup against Mewtwo. So again, this deck will probably be even more well positioned in the upcoming weeks, especially now that people are kind of, smartening up to Mewtwo. If more people end up playing Mewtwo, especially also on the ranked ladder, I think playing something like Weavile and Darkrai is actually a really good decision. So in the upcoming weeks, I think that Weavile Darkrai will actually be potentially like a top 3 pick, at least in this format. So yeah, and this is the list. I don't really have much else to say about it. It's just good. It's got all of the things that I would like to see here. 1 potion's interesting. I don't know if we really need potion for sure. Maybe swap that for a Rocky Helmet to fix some math in some scenarios, or maybe Giovanni. Who knows? I mean, maybe Mars. So there's a lot of options here. Again, it's very similar to the Giratina decks. There's a lot of room to swap out for trainer cards, but overall, I like the list. And we'll have to see again, what sort of the top deck ends up being. Here at 7th place, Awa from Japan was playing Beedrill and Meowscarada. So I know a lot of people are interested in grass right now. I think that we've gotten a lot of really, really cool grass type cards. Beedrill, of course, being one of them, but also Meowscarada. This is a card that a lot of people are very high on, and like I said, it's actually a lot better than I thought it would be, especially in this format. 140 HP, but with Giant Cape, that brings us to 160, and there's not many Pokemon that can KO us because Red doesn't work against Meowscarada because it's not an EX Pokemon, right? So Meowscarada, very, very good, 130 damage, that's 150 with Red, very important breakpoint there. So yes, and we're also playing Beedrill with it. This is an interesting deck because it's 2 Sprigatito, 2 Floragato, 2 Meowscarada, and then only a 1 Weedile, Kakuna, and Beedrill line. So definitely a emphasis on getting that Meowscarada out early. 2 Ericas, 1 Team Rocket Grunt, and then 2 Red. So again, the problem with this list is that we're playing so many Pokemon, we don't have that much room in the deck to play a lot of those great, trainer cards that maybe we would want to play in a deck like this. But, Beedrill in its own right with not Rocky Helmet, but Team Rocket Grunt is really, really oppressive. And Beedrill can just win you games in the late game. Beedrill's also better than I actually thought it was. I think having 2 energies in its attack cost is actually pretty relevant because we can basically always attack on turn 3 if Beedrill does get set up, and then again we can string shot with Kakuna on turn 2 to potentially paralyze our opponent and do some additional chip damage. So Beedrill's actually really, really good. Erica's Giant Cape allows it to live basically anything. Just a really, really strong card. I think I kind of underrated Beedrill for sure. Both of these cards I really did underrate, and I've been seeing a lot of Beedrill / Meowscarada on the ranked ladder. So, it's something that we definitely, have to think about and have to deal with as time goes on. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that grass type decks are actually pretty significant in the format right now. I mean, it didn't see like too much placements here. Like there was right here at 11th place a Meowscarada in Arceus deck, so a little bit of grass here in the top standings of the tournament, but for the most part it hasn't been seeing as much success or as much play as some of these other decks. But I do think that a lot of these new grass type cards are actually really, really good. And here at 8th place is going to be Gallade and Hitmonlee, and I'm actually really high on Gallade. I think that the Hitmonlee Gallade combo with things like Red, with Pokemon Communications, Iono, we're able to really consistently get what we want, which is again, Hitmonlee in the early game and then Gallade by turn 3 or turn 4. Gallade's got a lot of HP, and again, against things like Giratina, which probably have 4 energies onto it, we're just taking the KO. The only downside to Gallade, and again, in a list like this that's not playing Giant Cape, is that Mewtwo is hitting it for weakness. And Mewtwo, when it attacks, discards 2 energies. So if Mewtwo comes in, takes a KO on Hitmonlee, then Gallade is in kind of an awkward spot because it's not able to take the KO on a full HP Mewtwo. So again, Hitmonlee should be able to whittle down that Mewtwo, hopefully, but those potions and the Pokemon Center lady that we're seeing on Mewtwo might kind of, hurt its odds here. So, I like Giant Cape in Gallade to bring it to 190 because Mewtwo, again, does hit it for weakness. Mewtwo hits for 150, but overall, I think that Gallade is really well positioned. I think that realistically, just the Hitmonlee Marshadow, core, that early game core is really good in the format right now. Lots of Gyarados, lots of Druddigon, and again, just being able to kind of fix the math on some higher HP Pokemon like Mewtwo, really, really important. The other way to play this Hitmonlee Marshadow package is with Rampardos, and I do think that Rampardos with Hitmonlee and Marshadow is almost even better than Gallade in some scenarios. So really, really strong. 1 Red, 1 Iono, 1 Mars, 2 Cyrus. If we're playing Hitmonlee, I think we should be playing 2 Cyrus for sure. 2 Professor's Research, 2 Pokeball, and then 1 Pokemon Communications. We maybe could cut this Mars for a second Pokecom or a second Iono, give the deck maybe a little bit more consistency, but I think honestly, this deck can kind of, wait a little bit longer than it otherwise was able to in previous formats, because I think a lot of decks are a little bit slower now, which again, really does play into that early game Hitmonlee strategy. So yes, Gallade is very good. I have it as a top 5 deck right now in the format for sure. And if it's not top 5, it's kind of sitting right there next to Rampardos. So let's take a look at Gyarados really quick. Gyarados didn't perform as well here in Top Cut as I maybe thought it would, but again, I think that's because so many Hitmonlee decks and Gallade decks were probably doing pretty well in this tournament. And this is Gyarados. We've talked about it, I think, back-to-back videos. It's just, in my mind, probably the #1 core strongest deck of this format. Gyarados is just an incredible card. It's been overtuned since it came out. Now we have Manaphy, now we have Irida, now we have Misties, and now we have Red. So Gyarados with 180 HP, hitting for 160 with Red, is quite literally terrifying. And if we don't KO that Magikarp early in the game, then we're gonna have to deal with a Gyarados. And like I said, Mewtwo can't even KO this thing with Red. We're doing 160 or 170 with Red. So yeah, Gyarados is just living. So we're kind of reliant on like Rocky Helmet if we are playing Mewtwo and Giratina against Gyarados. And yeah, it just makes that matchup kind of sketchy. Overall, I think Gyarados is just super strong. Like I said, the only downside to Gyarados is its consistency. Sometimes that mana feed doesn't come out, or sometimes we don't find the Gyarados, so you know, that can be sort of a downside to the deck. But no, overall, I really think Gyarados is probably one of the strongest decks in the entire game right now, if not the strongest deck. I do expect it to be a very important player in this entire metagame, unless things like Hitmonlee with like Rampardos or Gallade become so popular that Gyarados kind of gets pushed out of the format. We'll have to see exactly how people favor the other top decks of the format. And then quickly, let's take a look at this other Meowscarada deck, which is actually playing the you know, the Arceus Carnivine combo. So this is sort of like this is an interesting one, actually. I think Carnivine's pretty good, and I think Arceus is not as good now, but again, we're not really attacking with Arceus. I think Arceus is kind of just hanging out on the bench, and then we're going to go into Meowscarada, which again, we're playing a lot of different Pokemon on the deck, so that consistency is a little bit lacking in its overall sort of setup approach, but if this deck does set up how it wants to, we can go Carnivine into Meowscarada into potentially a second Meowscarada, and I don't think there's a lot of decks that can kind of keep up with that. Realistically, a lot of you know, non-EX, you know, single prize Pokemon going through double Meowscarada is something that most decks realistically just can't do, especially with that early chip damage that Carnivine is providing. Red in here, Sabrina in here, Cyrus in here, and Leaf as well. Probably makes sense to get Arceus or this other Arceus out of the active spot if we do start with it. So yeah, one Pokemon Communications as well. This is an interesting deck. It got, what placement did it get here? 11th, so 8, 2, and 1. Pretty good outing, realistically, for this Arceus and Meowscarada deck. That's the cool thing I like about Meowscarada, is you can actually pair it with a lot of different Pokemon. You can pair it with Beedrill, Arceus, and Carnivine, as we saw right here. You can pair it with Executor. You could even pair it with Snorlax and Barry, which I have lost to on ranked battles before, so keep that in mind. Yeah, and if we scroll down here, kind of more of the same. I'm not going to spend like a ton of time going through all of these different decks and like analyzing the differences between all of the different deck lists. We'll kind of do that as the format goes on. Here is a Fighting Magnezone deck, which I do think is actually, again, a pretty good deck in the format right now. Entirely single prize Pokemon does mean that we can consistently go, you know, Hitmonlee into Magnezone and then into Marshadow, or vice versa. So basically speaking, Hitmonlee, really good positioned in the format. Things like Marshadow and Magnezone should be able to clean up as well. And yeah, I mean, I don't think Magnezone is maybe as good as other Stage 2 Pokemon, but the big upside to Magnezone is that we can commit that energy to Marshadow instead of having to commit it to like Gallade or Rampardos. So keep that in mind. I do think I would rather play something like Gallade and Rampardos with Hitmonlee, but Magnezone is still pretty good, and I think this deck is kind of carried by that Hitmonlee Marshadow core. So there it is. Yeah, Hitmonlee's well positioned, I think, very well positioned in the format for a variety of different reasons that we have talked about. And if we go down here, let's take a look here at 35th place. This is going to be Aiden here from Canada, and he was playing just straight Beedrill. So this was a deck that actually was like a top 5 deck after day 1 of competition. And yeah, you know, Beedrill here is doing Beedrill things. This is a really funny deck because it is just, you know, straight Beedrill, nothing else, which is honestly fine, because if you think about it, this deck doesn't need Pokeball, because Weedle's the only Pokemon we're ever going to be starting with, and Weedle can multiply to find its second Weedle. So this is one of the only decks, I think, in the game right now where we don't need to play Pokeball, technically speaking, although I have had the conversation with some of the people in my Discord server, which, by the way, you should join, link in the description down below. If we are going first with Weedle, we can, of course, attach an energy and then attack, and on our second turn, we have the option to evolve. So on our second turn, going first, not evolving Weedle is a little bit sketchy, so there is some scenarios where maybe you would want Pokeball in this deck, but again, realistically, we would always rather evolve and then String Shot with Kakuna to get the paralysis, and then we could go into Beedrill on turn 3. So this is a deck that actually doesn't mind going first, realistically, but again, 1 Pokemon Communications, 1 Iono, and then the 2 Team Rocket Grunt. So 2 Team Rocket Grunt and 2 Beedrill is very terrifying. This is what I would call more of a high roll deck. Sometimes you're going to get lucky and just discard energies all game from your opponent, and they're not going to be able to do anything. So I think that's an interesting strategy for Beedrill, but again, I think it really does showcase that Beedrill itself is actually a really, really strong Pokemon. And it's got a lot more HP than, you know, like you might realize. I mean, it's a Stage 2 EX Pokemon, so that makes sense. But 170 is crazy. With Giant Cape, with Erica's, with Potion, we're surviving for quite some time. And like I said, only 2 energies on Beedrill, so we should be able to attack on turn 3, even if we're going second or going first, which is really, really relevant. I think that's a big reason why Beedrill Beedrill is so good and why this sort of, straight Beedrill deck is actually fairly relevant. But yeah, so there it is, guys. I don't know. Oh, here's Rampardos and Hitmonlee, so I wanted to showcase this as well. This deck did pretty well. And again, I think if we're playing Rampardos right now, I know people are really high on Lucario, but 130 with Rampardos is kind of enough, and we're doing that extra damage with Hitmonlee or Farfetch'd in the early game with the fossils, right? Rampardos is a fossil Pokemon, so we're guaranteed to start with either these Hitmonlee, Marshadow, or Farfetch'd, and of course, 3 out of those 4 are really good leadoff Pokemon. Good into Gyarados, even better, honestly, into like the Druddigon decks. Just a really, really strong deck list as well. Entirely single prize Pokemon, which is definitely relevant. We can go like Hitmonlee, Rampardos, Marshadow, or Farfetch'd, Marshadow, Rampardos. There's a lot of combos we can do because our opponent has to KO 3 Pokemon. So I think that's another upside for this particular deck here. And yeah, again, I think that's one thing to take away here. Hitmonlee, very much, a lot of representation of Hitmonlee here in the top of this of these standings. So really high on Hitmonlee. And I'm really high on Mewtwo in particular, as well as Giratina decks. So yeah, there we go. That's going to be the first meta report of Shining Revelry. Hopefully this video was interesting to you guys. I am massively kind of interested in how things are developing. Like I said, the format is extremely different. It's so funny to me that, when we got all of these sort of new cards announced, or once we saw all of these new EX Pokemon and we saw the set release, a lot of people realized or thought rather at the time that this set would not be that good. It wouldn't be that influential, but as it turns out, it's made massive changes to the metagame. The game is entirely different now, and I think that it's a really incredible time to be playing Pokemon Pocket because of how many different decks are viable. I really think that there's about 6 or 7 decks that could kind of all have a place really at the top of the metagame, which is something that we've never really seen in Pokemon Pocket right now. Again, as time goes on, certain decks might kind of rise to the top and really cement themselves as sort of either the most played deck or the most winning deck. And of course, that always happens in metagames as time goes on. But honestly, we probably only have about 1 month until the next full set comes out, and when the next month of ranked comes out. So I'm actually having a blast with Pokemon Pocket right now. I think all of this chaos, all of these new decks, all of this information and statistics that we have available to us now is much more interesting because people again are really interested in what's best in what the matchups are with all of the ranked battles and stuff that people are playing in Pokemon Pocket. So yeah, I think now is as fun of a time to be playing this game as ever. I know some people have expressed a little bit of disappointment towards the game moving more toward like a pay-to-win strategy, especially with ranked battles. Like what we're going to be getting realistically is like the ranked season kind of coming out every month around the time that the new set comes out. So what it does is it does kind of put some pressure on players to have all of these new cards early on so that they can start competing in ranked battles. And I know that does kind of put some pressure on people to maybe want to spend money on the game. And I think it's all by design. I think this game really is designed for you to probably spend some money on it. So for all of those free-to-play players, I do understand that it can be frustrating. But again, nothing in life is free. And I, of course, would love to not have to spend any money on this game either. But that's just not how things happen, right? I mean, realistically, they're providing a service to us and giving us this game, and you can't expect to have everything available to you for free, right? And I think that's just the way that all games go now, although it is disappointing for sure. But yeah, interesting for sure, that whole sort of dynamic. But yeah, guys, there it is. There's the first tournament of Shining Revelry. Again, the format has changed so much. So crazy to me to see exactly what's kind of coming back right now. I'm really excited about all of the grass decks. I'm excited about Hitmonlee finding a place in the format, and I'm really excited about Mewtwo coming back and Giratina just being an incredibly strong card as well. Red, super impactful. Team Rocket Grunt, absolutely terrifying and hilarious in some scenarios. But yeah, anyway, let's wrap up this video. So tomorrow we have our tier list. It's been a while since I made a tier list, but I think I've been thinking a lot about where I'm going to be ranking some of these decks, and again, things will change a lot, but tomorrow we will be doing our meta tier list for this new format, and I'm really excited to get into it and to explain my reasoning to you guys. So stay tuned. Tomorrow is coming. The tier list is coming, and it should be a really fun video to make, and hopefully you guys enjoy it. So anyway, guys, let's get out of here. Peace out. Have a good one. Thank you guys so much for watching. Like and subscribe. And again, join the Discord link down in the description below. Good luck in your ranked battles. Hopefully this information was valuable to you, not only if you're competing in online tournaments, but if you're trying to grind up that ranked ladder. Again, I do think that a lot of this stuff does translate between each other. So yeah, hopefully this video was helpful. All right, guys, peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. And yeah, bye.